My name is Kaya Schilde. I'm a professor at the Boston University Pardee School of Global Studies. I'm also the director of the Center for the Study of Europe. And very recently, the Center for the Study of Europe and I have received a Jean Monnet Chair in European Security and Defense for the years 2022 to 2024. The Jean Monnet Chair is a teaching position, so we'll be teaching more topics around the EU at Boston University with that. But it also comes with a lecture series. And the way we envision the lecture series to be the most relevant and important is around the theme of Europe in the world. So not just looking at the EU as an actor on itself, but looking at the EU in a global context as a strategic actor, economic, diplomatic, energy, military, trade, and the way the EU fits and into the world and navigates the world. And so when we wrote this, we had a few people and images in mind, and one of them, central to our thinking, was Dr. Nathalie Tocci. She is not only the director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, a think tank in Italy, but she is also the person who, in the last, over the period of a few years, was the architect and writer of the EU's global strategy, which actually addressed these issues and grappled with what the role of the EU is, what it has been, and what it should be from a whole of government approach. So not just defense and security, but as a strategic actor in the world. And so we were delighted when we invited her and she said yes to launch this speaker series. So welcome, Dr. Tocci.
Well, thank you very much, Kaya, and indeed it's a real pleasure for me to be with you today. And indeed what I was kind of planning to talk to you about was the EU's new green narrative, and basically how through its green narrative, the European Union is really reviving itself. Now, I'm still going to talk about this, but I'm not going to start with this. I mean, I think that, you know, as we are literally living in Europe something that we hadn't been through essentially since 1945. This is really a time in which, you know, with war on the European continent, with the risk of a third world war breaking out, because essentially this is where we are. With the aggression, with the invasion of a nuclear state onto another, I really need to start with where we are now and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what this tells us about especially the European Union, where we are today and where we will be moving forward. Now, there is an important energy and therefore energy transition and therefore green dimension to the story, particularly in light of the role that Russia represents in terms of the EU's energy supplies at the moment. So what I'll do is I'll kind of loop back towards the end of my talk to where I really was planning to start at the beginning. So essentially looking at this invasion through a European lens, I think it's important to sort of, well, firstly take a step back and realize that the European Union and the European integration project, I would say more broadly, has really been in a stage of kind of existential crisis, or rather hopping from one existential crisis to the next, essentially since 2005. So in 2005, there was the first crisis, which was the crisis over the constitutional treaty. We then moved on to the next big crisis, the next big existential crisis, which of course was in 2008, the Eurozone crisis, well, the global financial crisis, which then developed or spilled into the Eurozone crisis. Then in 2015, we felt we were about to sort of fall apart again over the so-called migration crisis. Then in 2016, there was the Brexit referendum, and then of course came COVID. Now, all of these successive crises essentially saw the European Union being on the verge of collapse. The pandemic crisis really could have been, in a sense, a crisis too many. It really could have been the crisis that would have led to an sort of irreparable collapse of of the European Union. That didn't happen. There was essentially a sort of united response to the pandemic. And what was interesting, and I'll come back to this point at the end after I go through Russia and Ukraine, but what is very interesting is the way in which the European Union essentially emerged from this crisis in a more united and as a more united union, and with a refound sense of solidarity, was basically through the green narrative. So the green narrative essentially became the EU's new normative vision. It became the EU's new growth strategy. It basically, and it became the EU's new political project. I mean, given that this is an objective that basically European public opinion, especially younger generations, feel very strongly about, and it's an objective that all member states concur on. And all member states concur that it's the European Union that should be taking the lead on this particular theme. So this is in a sense where we were up until Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What has the invasion done? What is the invasion doing to us as a union? I think what it's doing is leading to a real paradigm shift. It's really leading to a refound sense, which to an extent sort of emerged also over the course of the pandemic, but in this very dramatic way has really emerged over this invasion. It has given us the sense that we are a community of fate. We're a community of fate and we are a community of values. And especially, we had rediscovered we were a community of fate over the course of the pandemic. We are now rediscovering that we are a community of values, particularly over the course of this dreadful invasion. Now, rediscovering that we're a community of fate and a community of values has essentially led to if you look at the last couple of decades, a really unprecedented sense of unity and solidarity between member states. If you look at the way in which the European Union has responded, for instance, on sanctions, the most far-reaching sanctions that have ever essentially been imposed on any third state. And if we think at just how significant this is, considering the multiple forms of interdependence, basically, and particularly as far as energy, of course, is concerned. But as I said, I'll kind of come back to this at the end. Interdependence between the European Union and Russia. It's really significant that we have come out with these far-reaching financial, technological, and energy-related sanctions. What is significant is that in many respects, I've been having some sort of interesting conversations with colleagues in Washington. The EU, in a sense, has actually been faster in many ways and more far-reaching, even compared to Washington. Particularly if you think about the sanctions concerning the Russian central bank, the EU moved first. I mean, we have a sort of time zone difference, so that explains it. But just to give a sense that this invasion, because it's obviously happening on European soil, is felt in a very visceral way by Europeans. And it's this kind of visceral sense of threat that Europeans face, which really led to this coalescing of member states, of European public opinion, over a package of sanctions, which, let's be very clear, is also very painful for Europeans, precisely because of this interdependence that there is with Russia. Economically painful, I mean. So a great show so far, I mean, of European unity and solidarity. Secondly, and I think this is really sort of unprecedented, there is the sense of we really do need to get our act together on defense. It's not as if, crises and conflicts did not exist before. It's not as if these wars, thinking particularly of kind of, wars in Syria, in Libya, it's not as if these wars did not have repercussions on Europe. whether you look at it through whatever angle, migration, energy, terrorism. It's clear that all of these wars had repercussions on Europe, but they were never, quote unquote, enough to really make the penny drop. I mean, they were never really enough to lead to this paradigm shift in Europe on this recognition that security and defense really have to be taken seriously. And that is something which literally changed overnight with this invasion. Here I'm obviously mainly thinking about Germany. When Berlin essentially says an extra $100 billion this year on defense, from now onwards, at least 2% of GDP spending on defense. This is a game changer. I mean, I don't know how to put it in a clearer way. It really conveys this sense of, we get it. There is war in Europe today. And there is war in Europe, which today is in Ukraine, but there is nothing that can guarantee that it will not go beyond Ukraine. And therefore, this paradigmatic shift really has to take place. Now, I was at the Munich Security Conference, which took place 2 days before Russia's invasion. And I was moderating a panel with the German defense minister. And back in Munich, so, this was the weekend, literally the weekend before, it was clear to everyone in that room that there would have been an invasion of sorts. It was more or less clear that something was going to happen in the next 48 hours, which indeed it did, and that Russia was going to do something. No one, of course, knew exactly what Russia was going to do exactly, what that invasion, what that intervention, because back then, people thought that maybe it was going to be something more contained, more limited. And yet everyone knew that something was going to happen. And yet at that time, I kind of asked publicly questions concerning, defense spending, questions concerning sending weapons, for instance, to Ukraine. And the response was very clear: no, 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 no. And so I just kind of cite this anecdote to give you the sense of how literally from one day to the next, there was a real paradigm shift, which was not only limited, quote unquote, to government. This is really something which is supported by public opinion. I mean, you basically have 70% basically of German public opinion backing the government's policy on these questions. And it was unthinkable only, I repeat, only a few days before. Now, what's also interesting at EU level is that this has also led to a paradigm shift at EU level. There was, for instance, the possibility through the existence of a financial instrument called the European Peace Facility to provide military support in different forms, but it was never used. Again, from one day to the next, here comes the European Commission, for whom defense was literally a dirty word up until a few years ago, that puts 500 million on the table to send weapons to Ukraine. So again, a real paradigm shift that happened overnight, and it happened overnight because the threat that Russia's invasion poses is a threat. Europeans live it as a threat not only to Ukraine, but to Europe more broadly. Third example, where there's been a real sort of paradigm shift from one day to the next, is on asylum and migration. Now, again, you will probably be aware of the fact that migration has been a particularly divisive subject in the European Union. I mean, earlier I was citing the so-called, I keep on calling it so-called migration crisis, because I think it was mainly a political crisis. I'm always uncomfortable in referring to it as a migration crisis, because essentially, and I think actually the numbers, especially if we compare them to today, are quite significant. If we think about 2015, which was, the big invasion of migrants and refugees, basically, if you look at it over the course of 1 year, we were basically talking about 1 million people that came to Europe, mainly from Syria, not only from Syria, but mainly from Syria over the course of 1 year, in a union of Back then, of course, the UK was still a member of the European Union and therefore a union of 500 million people. So numerically, frankly speaking, that was not a crisis. Politically, though, it was. I cite the numbers because I think the contrast to today's numbers are really significant. Today, as we speak, 3 million Ukrainians have already entered the European Union, and that is in 3 weeks. So it's 3 times as much what happened in 2015 over the course of 1 year. And this is, as we know, the war is still raging, the invasion is still raging. So this figure could very easily, in fact, for sure, it will at least double, if not more than that. So we are really talking about something very significant. Now, you would have thought, well, you know, if Europeans were divided back in 2015 on how to handle 1 million people, just imagine today with 3 million and growing. Well, exactly the opposite is true. Again, you know, I think there are various reasons which explain why it's the case, not least of which the fact that those countries that were on the very stark no to any form of common European asylum policy, any form of European common migration policy, which are basically the Eastern European countries, are precisely the countries that today are on the front line, basically, in the war on Ukraine, and which are receiving the greatest numbers of these 3 million refugees which are coming into the European Union. And therefore, these countries have an incentive for there to be a European response. And for the first time ever, something called the temporary protection mechanism, which basically is a mechanism, law, if you like, which allows any refugee that enters the European Union to move and live and work freely, basically within the Union. It has been activated for the first time. So all of this hugely significant. Obviously, it will become more significant the way in which it, you know, from a crisis and therefore from an quote unquote ad hoc response, you then systematize it into something structural and something systemic. So we're obviously not there yet. But again, I think what is extremely important is that there has been this sense of solidarity between Europeans and towards, obviously, Ukraine, because this war is very much, and I'll say it for the nth time, lived as a war on us, if you like. Another example, which I think is very important, which again suggests the way in which through this crisis, the European Union is kind of making and remaking itself, is the economy. Now, already over the course of the pandemic, the European Union had reacted by putting on the table its financial program called Next Generation EU. Now, this was not in and of itself a, if you like, a structural mutualization of debt, but basically what it was is money, 750 billion, which were being raised, even if in a one-off way, by the European Commission, essentially, I'm slightly simplifying here, but essentially issuing bonds. So for that 750 billion extra pot of money, so it's not a mutualization of past debt, but a mutualization of the future debt issued as a result, if you like, of the expenses to be incurred from the economic recovery, basically, of the pandemic. Now, what's interesting about the debate today is that the idea is that obviously that it will not be enough. It will not be enough to sustain particularly 2 areas where a lot of spending will need to take place from now moving forward. The first of which is, I cited it earlier, defense. Earlier I talked about Germany a lot, and let's face it, you know, a country like Germany has its own national resources. It essentially took if you like, 6 months to get to this decision. I mean, it's, well, most likely, yeah, no, actually, since 6 months. It took from March, when the pandemic broke out. The main then decision was in July, and then eventually sort of it was finalized, if you like, by the end of the year. But it took several months, basically, to do what it takes, if you like, over the pandemic. So we're not there yet, 3 weeks into this invasion. We're not there in terms of, you know, constituting a new fund. The resistance is there also because, as I said earlier, Next Generation EU was really looked at as an exception to the rule. Now, once you start having 2 exceptions to the rule, then it's pretty clear that the rule itself is changing. And so those that are uncomfortable with the changing of the rule, particularly in Northern European countries, particularly in Germany and the so-called frugal states to the north, the resistance is there. But my sense is that this is very much, in a sense, the, you know, moving in this direction is probably the way in which we will be going. Another area where there has been a real paradigm shift over the last 3 weeks is really enlargement. So enlargement was basically, I mean, I don't know how to put it in a clearer way, dead in the water up until this invasion. I mean, not only the enlargement to Turkey, but also enlargement to the Western Balkans. Yes, you know, there were, you know, everyone talked the talk, but no one really walked the walk, you know, neither in Brussels, nor in the capitals, nor in fact in many of these enlargement countries. Now, again, and not to mention the fact that obviously no one in their wildest dreams talked about, you know, and thought about enlargement to Ukraine or to Moldova or to Georgia. Again, over the course of these 3 weeks, that is another paradigm that has completely changed. So enlargement is very much back on the agenda. As a political project, you know, there is this sense, which I think to an extent, the logic also applies to NATO enlargement, but that obviously has an element of risk which is not there as strongly as if applied to EU enlargement. But there is this sense of, did we make a mistake in dropping the enlargement agenda, which is basically what happened gradually from 2007 onwards. So after the quote unquote big bang enlargement of 2004 to Central and Eastern European countries, and then Romania and Bulgaria that came on in 2007, with the exception of Croatia, which then came into the Union in 2013. Basically, enlargement was, as I said, was a dying and dead, and then eventually dead process. Now we're back into thinking, well, it was maybe a mistake to stop this agenda. I mean, maybe if a country like Ukraine had been a member of the European Union, maybe we wouldn't be where we are today. And in particular, looking at the way in which Ukraine today is essentially fighting for its freedom and its democracy. And hey, aren't these the European values that we all cherish? Well, all of a sudden, something that was unthinkable up until 3 weeks ago becomes not only possible, but is agreed. So Ukraine, and then following Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova submitted their applications for EU membership. And the European Council in Versailles last week basically kicked off the process, saying to the Commission, can you now, given that the process foresees that the Commission now officially replies with a quote unquote opinion on their, the application, the membership application made by these countries. So the ball is rolling. The ball is rolling on something, as I said, that basically seemed to have been completely dead. And then the final aspect, and here I come back to the points that I wanted to make before the war started. The final aspect is really energy and the energy transition. So it is very clear that whatever happens, you know, even in the most idyllic of circumstances of a ceasefire agreement being signed today, which unfortunately is not on the cards, but even in a, you know, a sort of first best sort of, you know, idyllic world, the die is really cast, I think, when it comes to the EU's energy relationship, and not only energy relationship with Russia. The decisions that are being taken, I mean, the recognition that we made a mistake. And it was a mistake that was, I think, informed not only by a sense of, in a sense, idealism and even hubris of the post-Cold War period, but it was also a sense that was informed by a longer history dating back to the Cold War, in which energy, even with the Soviet Union, I mean, you know, particularly looked at through German eyes, was basically the one area where even with the Soviet Union, there was cooperation. And there was a degree of reliability and there was a degree of predictability. And this was something that had not been sort of weaponized vis-a-vis the European Union in the past. I think this war, again, has completely turn the tables on that debate. Again, you know, the way in which Germany literally over the course of a night took the decision to suspend the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, the way in which the European Union essentially is making plans to reduce and eventually erase completely its gas interdependence with Russia. These are all decisions that are being taken now. And this is why I say, almost regardless of what happens from today onwards, I find it very difficult to imagine that we will go back to where we were with Russia in energy terms. Now, all of this then connects to, well, how is it that we achieve our energy independence vis-a-vis Russia? So you have energy security coming back into the debate in a way in which it had broadly disappeared, basically, from the European public lexicon, essentially up until recently. And you have a situation now whereby the short term, the medium term, and the long term need to be brought, in a sense, in sync. So in the very short term, and by the very short term, I mean between now and the end of the year, or between now and the next, 2 years in some cases, basically it is about doing, and therefore getting whatever you can in order to replace Russian fossil sources. So basically what you're seeing in countries, for instance, like my own, is a sort of spasmodic gas shopping around the world. And it is trying to see in what way can we, if you take the case of Italy, for example, Italy imports just over 40% of its gas from Russia. This basically amounts to 29 billion cubic meters of gas per year. And so the question is, how do we replace 29 cubic meters, as in by as soon as possible? And so there is this kind of, spasmodic gas hunting, or, we can get maybe 10 more from Algeria, we can get 1 more from Egypt, we can get 1 more from Libya, we can get 4 or 5 more from Qatar. What about Angola? What about Congo? So there is this kind of, trying to find as quickly as possible alternative sources, which, let's face it, these are fossil sources. I mean, these are not renewable sources. But so in the very short term, you have a situation whereby energy security is achieved through the diversification of fossil sources and routes and the infrastructure associated to these. But then at the same time, you also realize that your medium to long-term strategy to achieve your energy independence is basically through the energy transition. So given that renewable sources are, sort of far more evenly distributed. I mean, there is still a degree of, in a sense, trade when it comes to renewable, but you can produce a lot more of it at home, and also you can produce a lot more of it, and you can cooperate with many more countries. In fact, Ukraine, for one, is one of the countries that had already pre-war been identified as one of the main energy partners of the European Union in renewable terms. And here the thinking was mainly revolving around the role that Ukraine could play in green hydrogen. Similar arguments being made for Morocco. So basically, formerly energy poor countries, or rather countries which are poor in fossil sources, all of a sudden actually become potential partners and resources if you're thinking about it in energy transition terms. Now, I think the difficulty that we have at the moment and that we will have in the months, in a sense, and years ahead, is how to stick to an energy security paradigm, but weave into it, as the months go by and therefore as the years go by, an energy transition and therefore decarbonization agenda to it, which enables you to go back to the starting point of where my talk started, which was really about the idea that a green Europe is the way to revive the European project. It is the way that provides the European Union with a normative vision, with an economic growth strategy, and basically with a political project. We're now in the midst, in a sense, of this crisis, which at the same time offers, it really puts us at a crossroad. It can either set us back in terms of kind of leading us to set to one side what our energy transition and therefore decarbonization objectives were, or it can accelerate this even further. This is very front and center of the minds of policymakers in Brussels, in European capitals. There is a lot of attention. You know, the document that was published a couple of days ago by the European Commission, Repower EU, is all about keeping our eyes on the ball of the transition and bringing the transition into the energy security debate. At the moment, of course, you know, these are intentions, these are policy statements. You know, we really have to see how the implementation is going to work out. But having said all this, you know, I think that the fact that we are looking at these two things as two things which now need to be woven together is exactly where we should be in terms of not only confronting the tragedy of the war today, but also where we as Europe need to sort of move and therefore move towards in the months and the years ahead. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I turned my video off so that I wasn't distracting anyone during your talk. This is the way you characterize these things, I find uniquely refreshing. I was actually just reading your 2017 book about your process of coming to the EU global strategy. And I have two big questions for you that I feel like there are so many people I can't ask these questions of. And you uniquely have this wonderfully strategic, but also, I'm not going to say realist, but very realistic perspective in terms of grounded and interest-based. And so I was reminded while I was reading your book about framing the EU global strategy, just about how illegal in the past the conversation around interests has been, but that it's not mutually exclusive with values. And this issue of energy security has always been a little bit of a missing link in terms of, you know, linking these things together, both values in terms of relationships between European states and authoritarian states, but also interests, as in both interests towards energy transition, energy security, and geopolitics. And I've felt, you know, I'm somebody who's been paying attention to these issues for 20 years now, teaching them, writing on them. And when students ask me, what is the EU's energy security strategy? I've often said, well, I can point to a few documents, but it's not something, you know, right at the center of conversations. And so this, for so many reasons, is so refreshing. And I haven't read the Commission document yet, but I like hearing it from you too. So I'm going to push you on two questions that I had. I had a whole list, but your talk really clarified to me which questions I wanted to ask you. So this issue of energy transition in the EU, I mean, it's been framed as a decarbonization, climate transition issue. And I mean, to be fair, even though Germany has been not good about being, you know, having a lack of strategy about this geopolitically, they always did imagine dependence on Russian gas to be medium term as they transitioned longer term towards renewables. But what's interesting to me is I really want to push you harder about the role of the EU very specifically in this. Because when I think of the EU's powers, relative powers, and where it has great authority, state like, or even sometimes more than state like authority, is in especially in market power, is in antitrust power, in breaking up monopolies and things like that. It is more of something that undoes concentration rather than build it up through industrial policy. But when we talk about things like decarbonization, we are talking about industrial policy, and it is the role of states to, I'm going to use the word manipulate markets or create artificial markets through picking winners and losers. I know those are very politically charged terms, but industrial policy requires states to put their finger on the, or their thumb on the weight, on the scale, by actually building up firms or industries for decarbonization. And so I was wondering what your relative insights about that strategically were. It's because it's not necessarily EU strength or EU authority to do that, or whether you imagine it to be more coordinating. But industrial policy really does require somewhat centralized authority in that area. Yeah. And then my second part of that question is about when I, in my intro classes, teach about international relations and climate change, I point to the fact that the global north, Europe and the United States, are historically the ones responsible for a century of climate change carbon emissions. But if you look at the next 100 years, I think the United States and Europe collectively make up about 5%. And so there is almost no talking about decarbonization or Green New Deals without talking about global Green New Deals, because otherwise it's just displacement race to the bottom, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was really fascinated by your conversation about the EU neighborhood policy, essentially, of states like Ukraine and Morocco, and the degree to which that strategically would be part of this larger strategic insight. So thank you.
Well, fantastic questions. So on the first, I think that firstly, through the pandemic and now through the war, basically the EU is waking up the hard way to the fact that, and to an extent, you can make a similar argument about the US, because in the US too, we talk about industrial policy in a way in which we didn't since the 1970s. But the EU, which is a quintessentially liberal project, which then, particularly beginning in the sort of second half of the 1980s, became a quintessentially neoliberal project in economic terms, is now waking up to a different world. And you see the way in which the Commission struggles with this. So it's kind of, it realizes that now we're seeing it on energy, but we saw it also over the course of the pandemic, saying, okay, there is a suspension of state aid rules. You see the way in which now there is a recognition that, if we're serious about the transition, okay, our antitrust policies remain the same. So there are a number of things that, of course, we don't like to see happen. And in a different sector, you will recall that the Commission stood up against the Alstom-Siemens merger on the basis of, obviously, of antitrust. And yet, maybe Alstom Siemens is something where, something like that will always, you will always find resistance in a sense from the Commission. And yet there is a recognition that if we want to develop certain industrial capacities, which are key to the transition, in fact, you can make the same argument for the energy transition as well as the digital transition. Well, they require support and they require money. And so, on digital, the EU is putting, I'm not quite sure this is a project that will succeed, but it's putting, a fair amount of money on developing a European semiconductor industry. On green, very interesting, this concept of the industrial alliances. So you have an industrial alliance on batteries, and you have an industrial alliance on hydrogen. You have an industrial alliance on critical minerals. So there is this sense that industrial policy is back. Now, how, I think that it's, it goes back to kind of, principle pragmatism. The principle of competition policy is being shaken. The pragmatism of a world that has changed is coming in. And the point is, what will be the new equilibrium? I think it's too early to say, because a lot of this is really being determined by context. But it's clear that whatever that new steady state will be, it will look quite different from what the old one did, because the old one simply belonged to a world that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's a world that was basically kind of, swept aside first with the pandemic and now with the war. Now, on the question of the global south, and indeed this is really the kind of topic of the book that I wanted to talk to you about, which is going to be published in September, which is the Greenland Global Book. And the argument that I make in that book is, in a sense, very much going in the line of your question, Karia. Because it's basically saying it's all very well and good, and green is our new big thing, and how great we are. We're going to get to net zero by 2050, and we're the only ones that have a plan to do this. Everyone has the goal. We have a plan. It may not be the best plan in the world, but we have a plan, and no one else does. Fantastic. Now, great. But we represent 7% of global emissions. And so, you basically, unless you develop a policy or policies to draw the rest of the world along with you, it doesn't mean to say that, the rest of the world has to adopt the European Green Deal and Fit for 55. Everyone will have their own pace and shape and form of the transition. But the EU needs to develop an equally powerful external dimension to its European Green Deal, because unless it does, unless the energy transition and climate really become front and center of what our external action is in the world, and whether it's through trade policy, development policy, security policy, I mean, basically this has to be the number one goal. Unless we do that, what we end up having is either a very, in the best of circumstances, a very green Europe in a very brown world. In the worst and more likely circumstances, a green Europe that will not be a green Europe, because, and this is an argument that I really try and unpack in my book, this energy transition is a political transition. It's a policy-driven transition. Yes, it has an important technological and market-driven component to it, but we need to do it. If we just left it to technology and the markets, we would not get to net neutrality by 2050. Maybe we would get to net neutrality by 2070, 2080, 2090, I don't know, but we will all be fried by then, right? So in order to accelerate that transition, you need to put policies in place to get there. But these policies, given that it's political, given that it's policy driven, these policies have potentially adverse socioeconomic distributional effects. And so if you don't develop that external component, if the rest of the world doesn't come along with you, the internal pushback against these green policies is going to basically erase the political conditions to enable you to drive through those policies in the first place. And so basically my argument is that a green Europe is fine, but it can only exist if it develops as a global Europe as well.
Thank you so much for that fantastic answer. Also, I look forward to that argument, to reading that argument in the book and in any talks you give. I do want to push you harder on that, though. Not that you have the answers to everything, but it is absolutely the right strategic position. But then the devil is in the details, right?
Yeah.
In terms of, I'm fully aware that a post-Brexit Europe or EU is actually more cohesive and actually has a little bit more political capital, and now potentially even more with a renewal of the project for geopolitical reasons and security reasons. And so there may be enough momentum or capital, but these things are deeply costly, right? So it's not just social displacement and political economy winners and losers within societies, but across Europe. And then the devilish details about a global Green New Deal quite literally mean Europeans paying for decarbonization elsewhere, or even absorbing more historically dirty technologies inside Europe, whether it's fracking or nuclear or mining, because
Yeah.
that's some of the nature of the debate in the United States, is whether to onshore or make domestic things that have been offshored, like rare earth minerals, because they're dirty and because societies that have had the luxury of not having them inside their borders don't, and it's extremely expensive. So I know that it's the however $1 million-billion question to answer, but I just wanted to push you because I know you're thinking about this and it's the most important question to ask.
Yeah, I think it's really important, as you say, to kind of unpack this, both in its different geographies as well as in its different policy areas. So I think, sort of just sticking, I mean, I can then go global as well, but just sticking to the sort of neighborhood. I mean, we need to make the distinction. So what does it mean to kind of, get serious about this in global terms? Well, firstly, I think, we need to make the distinction between climate and the costs of climate action and the costs of the energy transition, because there is a big sort of category, which is not so much the cost of the energy transition, but it's the cost of the climate crisis. And so what does this mean in terms of climate adaptation? Now, in fairness, the European Union on this particular question is the best of a bad lot. When in Glasgow, the debate on climate finance, the famous 100 billion per year, if you look at the numbers, we're obviously not where we should be, but the EU is certainly better than everyone else. And also, if you look at how that climate finance pot is unpacked, you see that whereas most countries basically tend to spend more on climate mitigation, the EU is actually rather good in actually spending 52% on adaptation. Why do I emphasize adaptation? Well, because particularly when it comes to public money as opposed to private money, I think it's hugely important that the public money goes to adaptation. It makes more economic sense to do mitigation. You can make money out of mitigation. Basically, you don't really make as much money out of adaptation. So that's really where, in a sense, public institutions need to step in. So I think, climate adaptation is something that we have to improve on, but at least I must say that on that particular aspect, we're at least better than the rest. Then we move to the transition story. And here we again really need to kind of unpack what is it that we need to do and towards whom. Because if you take fossil fuel producing countries, I mean, these are really the countries that we need to focus on in order to enable them to make the transition. Well, we're talking about very different types of countries. I mean, the UAE arguably doesn't need really a lot of, much of our help. Iraq does. Nigeria does, Algeria does. How do we, I go back to the kind of conundrum that we're in now. Algeria now will represent an important way in which we replace Russian gas. But if we, quote unquote, just end up buying more Algerian gas, are we actually doing Algeria any favors in a transition? Should we therefore also be, for instance, yes, importing Algerian gas, but investing in carbon capture and storage projects in Algeria in order to enable each country to move along its own transition journey? But this will basically mean, it means funds. It means within our trade agreements, and this is something which is already being done, within our trade agreements, where once upon a time we just had our essential elements clauses, which are basically human rights clauses. The idea is to actually make our trade agreements Paris aligned. So insert Paris-related conditionality, if you like, in our trade agreements. It is about diplomacy, in our political dialogue with countries. Well, this should basically always be front and center of the agenda. It's about our development assistance. Now, here, what we basically have is the new financial instrument of the European Union, the neighborhood, basically the INDICI, the neighborhood and development instrument. Great that we have a fairly important percentage, 30% is being earmarked for climate-related projects. But then, as you say, the devil is in the details. So you have this 30%, but then the specific programs tend to then be negotiated with the recipient state. And what if the recipient state has other priorities and it actually prefers the money to be spent on budget support, for example? How do you ensure that you actually reach that 30% earmarked global goal in the sense that you set for yourself? So I think, you need to kind of break it down into different elements of your external action, as well as the different geographies in which you have to play this out. Just to sort of come back to the Russia point on this, because I really wanted to share this because it's something that I'm really struggling with at the moment. So, my argument pre-war on Russia was Russia and in energy terms was, it's not actually in the EU's interests to simply sever the energy interdependence with Russia. Because it's not in the EU's interest to simply push Russia into China's lap. What we should be doing is, rather than simply chop, 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 cutting those energy relationships, what we should be doing is phasing in the green element, basically greening those long-term relationships, and therefore supporting Russia in the development of its renewable industry and its development of its hydrogen industry. And, and on one level, that is an argument that is still, still holds true, in the same way as, for instance, in the US-China confrontation, the traditional argument is, you hear it from the Biden administration nonstop, we compete on everything apart from climate. I mean, climate is the one area where we need to cooperate because, hey, this is basically an existential challenge for all. Well, the same argument actually applies to the EU and Russia. And yet, you look at the situation now, and it just kind of belongs to a different universe to imagine that the EU is going to support renewables in Russia. So again, how and when will we be able to reconcile or re-reconcile the urgency of the now with the urgency, though, of that long-term goal, which is the existential challenge of climate change?
Although I laughed, I smiled when you said, the EU should be greening Russian energy. That is an important thing for EU neighborhood policy to be thinking about post-crisis. I think it's the most hopeful thing I've heard in a very long time. And so I laughed, but I share it. I laughed because it's just so distant from what's
It's so distant. I know, that's
right.
The thing. It's so distant and it seems so unrealistic. And yet at the same time, if you think of it in climate terms, which is not less existential than a third world war, actually. But the time frames are obviously different.
So while you were talking, just to give you a preview of the next 18 minutes or so, I have a few follow-up questions from audience chat about global Green New Deal and energy transitions, kind of devil detail questions. And then I have a question about EU enlargement that was prompted by your talk. And we have a few questions that are Ukraine and refugee related. And so couple quick, as we say, two-finger points. One is just I wanted to squeeze one in that one of the most interesting things I've read in the last few years about global Green New Deal and industrial policy in terms of what power global north or large advanced industrial states have. It's not even in convincing or in negotiating with other countries, but it is in the power that they have to drive prices down for new technologies, like like subsidize, and whether it's cells or semiconductors, through their own industrial policy, and then they just manipulate global markets that way. And it's a simple but powerful idea because it doesn't rely on all the assumptions about things working out diplomatically or convincing others for how to spend their money. It's just that if solar cells are a certain price, that will drive global demand or consumption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I at the same time, I mean, I think what we're seeing though at the moment, and then the question is how to reverse this trend. What you're seeing at the moment is that the investments in the transition are actually very high amongst the private sector because it makes economic and therefore, it makes commercial sense. And yet, most of them are in the OECD countries. And why are they in the OECD countries? Well, basically because you develop a technology in a place where you already have a market. Now, and that, of course, is one of the reasons why this is not happening in the same way in developing countries, particularly in Africa. So I think that when it comes to basically creating an incentive structure for companies to make those investments not just in rich countries but in emerging and developing countries, you need to create different incentives for them to do so. I mean, I think a sort of interesting development in this respect is the EU's move towards a taxonomy. So basically this is developing a taxonomy for sustainable investments and categorizing basically, which are the investments which are considered to be sustainable and therefore which, given that, investors now are increasingly pushed to concentrate part of their portfolio on ESG, in a sense, compliant investments. There is basically, if you're taxonomy compliant, you have easier access to capital. So I think instruments such as this create the financial incentives for companies, basically, not just to invest in OECD countries, but to broaden out those investments in non-OECD countries as well.
That's really smart because it's a use of existing EU regulatory power to shape the strategy and risk profiles of firms. That's what they're always asking for and what they need.
Yeah, and let's be very clear, the energy transition requires so much money that it is not going to happen without the private sector. It will only happen with the private sector.
Yeah. Right. It's not just industrial policy. It needs industrial policy, but not just.
Yeah.
So one of our guests, Richard Rosen, asked a series of questions, detail-oriented questions about energy transition. One was that he is saying that as far as they know, it's one of the biggest intra-European costs is converting the heating systems of all these gas-heated buildings to electric heating technologies, even though that could create jobs, but it's still a massive, massive infrastructural effort. Also, is a key ingredient of new EU industrial policy to increase the manufacture of solar voltaic cells, so they're not overly dependent on Chinese solar cells. Any policy insight about that? And then what would you price or estimate the cost, maybe annual cost, of a net zero carbon future at the EU level? And that, I suppose that's whole of society cost, not just government spending. So those are 3 questions from the same person, but very good questions.
So on the buildings, I think that, yes, I mean, obviously this is a challenge for all countries, but for European countries, this is a particularly complicated challenge because we're mainly talking about pretty old cities and therefore, old buildings. There is, I'm thinking here mainly about the Commission's Renovation EU project. I mean, this is very much part of the agenda. So there are specific programs, specific funding lines to make this happen. But it will not only happen with EU money. I mean, this is something which we're talking about, something which is so, how can I put it? I mean, it's just so sort of pervasive everywhere in society. I mean, it just requires a total overhaul of the way in which our cities and, our homes and our cities and everything is kind of built and run, that the EU level money can only be a trigger, basically, can only be a sort of incentive for national sort of programs to develop along the same lines. On solar, Well, this is really, this is a very complicated one. I mean, it's another very complicated one. So, one thing is, where do you actually put your solar panels? Okay, so that's not a China story. That's basically mainly mainly an Africa story. So there is an important, in a sense, EU-Africa partnership there, potential to be reaped, particularly when it comes to renewables and in particular when it comes to solar. But yet, the question was pointing to the technology aspect to it. I mean, the technology and on solar, China really has, I'm not sure whether and this is true also for the United States. I think on solar, technologically, we may have kind of missed the train. I think it's very difficult to imagine how on solar technology we can catch up with China. So, I don't know what the answer to this is. I think it really raises huge conundrums, which also relate not just to the transition, but also to broader human rights questions, and the competition between, we're normally coming back here to one of your questions earlier, we're normally kind of sort of led to think about these things as kind of contrasts between whatever interests and values. I think this is a case where you have the contradiction actually between two sets of values, because obviously decarbonization is a normative vision, it's a value, right? But not importing goods produced through forced labor is also a value. And yet you cannot achieve one without the other when it comes to solar and therefore meeting your renewables targets. So how is the way to square the circle? Should you basically say, I'm going to try and catch up, I'm not going to probably make up, but I'm really going to invest in my solar industry? Should you basically be saying, well, no, maybe it would probably make more sense to think of what my comparative advantages are, and as opposed to solar, on wind, well, on wind, Europe actually does quite well. So maybe the investment should be not on solar, on wind. I don't have an answer to the question, but I think it's a very difficult one to square. There was a third one, but I can't read my handwriting.
The third one was just on
the cost.
I think estimate of cost. Like, I know that's not one of your jobs to estimate the overall cost, but
all I can give you is the cost per year that the International Energy Agency puts. But this is not just European. This is global. So it basically says that to reach our targets, 1.4 trillion need to be spent per year. Given what emissions look like, you can kind of figure out basically what this means for Europe. But this is just for mitigation; it's not for adaptation.
Thank you. This was fantastic. I'm so glad that I was able to look at the chat and follow up with those great questions. I have a few more questions from the chat, but I'm going to insert myself back in because I have one more big question for you. And I struggled with how to ask it in the middle, but bear with me because I might get a little muddy in the middle of my question because it's awkward, difficult stuff. It's not an easy question. And I was prompted by your comments and your excellent comments that perhaps a counterfactual of not enlarging the EU to Ukraine, or essentially having enlargement fatigue at a certain point in the last 20 years might have been a mistake in retrospect. And I think that's a really interesting counterfactual, and even more interesting because it's not, we can't pin to one causal factor for Russian behavior right now. Of course, the realists say it's about NATO enlargement and et cetera, and then if the people who know Russia and Eastern Europe say that it's about more internal factors and more post or neo-colonial factors or different kinds of domestic issues. But an issue that is often dismissed, even though it's right there in front of us, is that the initial Russian military action and takeover of Crimea and initiation of war in the Donbass was prompted by the EU accession agreement, not accession, the
DCFTA.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So not accession, but the association agreement, right? And they didn't say it's exactly why, but causally in time, it's very associated, this kind of threat of EU enlargement. And when I teach the topic, I kind of joke that maybe Putin couldn't tell the difference between the EU and NATO, and it's kind of a cheeky comment, but the point is that you've done a lot of thinking about what the EU's interests are. And during this time, it could almost be said, here's where I'm getting muddy, and I might need you to save me and just jump in. I think that at a certain point in time, it was a bit clearer from the outside, like from Russia maybe, what the EU's interests were than from the inside. Because others could see in some ways what the EU's interests were, and the EU hadn't yet seen what its interests were.
Yeah.
And that's not supposed to be mean or anything. It's just prompted by the fact that there was an era that was a little bit strategy free, let's say, or where interests hadn't yet coalesced before you did your job and did that work, that process-based work about turning interest into strategy. And that's during this phase of maybe the EU enlarged before it even realized, or not enlarged, because it's not enlarged to Ukraine, but it was having a robust neighborhood policy that looked like enlargement from the outside. Let's just say that. Or could be interpreted. And perhaps that was just a blip of kind of process without strategy. But I wanted to invite you to speak about that.
No, I think this is an excellent question. I think it's absolutely fair to say that, and I think it belonged to the international order that we were in indeed not realizing the geopolitical implications of what we were doing, because this was, when the enlargement policy, when enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe, and then the neighborhood policy, I mean, that was a world in which that was the good old liberal international order. That was a world in which every country, including Russia, by the way, would inexorably, sooner or later, get to the Holy Land. And it was the EU's obvious and only possible mission that of kind of helping these countries along. There was no other possible destination other than that Holy Land. And I think, there was this, I wouldn't even say belief in it. I mean, it was not even debated. It was kind of obvious. Now, that obviously turned out to be completely false. But so let me put it this way. I'll answer the question this way. If I look at, the time, basically, from the end of the Cold War till where we are today, you almost divide it into sort of three phases, which I think are enlargement related. Not only enlargement related, but I think they're enlargement related. So let's say, there's the age of idealism, maybe even of hubris. So I would say it's basically that period between basically 1991 through to, I would say, 2008, through to the Russia-Georgia war in 2008. And that was indeed the age in which, we were simply about kind of diffusing our norms and values and goodness to the world, and not even remotely thinking that this was a geopolitical project. Then you basically have the period that starts in 2008, or the penny doesn't quite drop in 2008, but in retrospect, that's basically where, when and where things changed. Then it became clear after 2014, the annexation of Crimea. So I would say the period basically between 2008 and 2022 and this war, I would say is the age of pragmatism. So it's, hey, maybe it wasn't simply a sort of technocratic process. Maybe it was actually political and geopolitical. Maybe Russia actually did have a bit of a point, and it had security concerns, and maybe, we just kind of went ahead, not realizing what we were doing. And so I would say that it was an age of pragmatism in two respects. It was both pragmatism in saying, hey, yes, but look at how Russia's behaving now. So, it needs to be stopped, and therefore after 2014 the sanctions. But there was also the pragmatism of saying, hey, but maybe they have a point, so let's keep on finding ways to engage with them. And so you basically had a kind of two-pronged approach, which was sanctions on the one hand, engagement on the other, and putting enlargement on the back burner as a kind of byproduct to all of this. I think now we are in a third phase, which I would say is really an age of war. And an age of war which brings us back to the starting point, but not in that kind of technocratic, Heidi-like way, sort of Pollyannish way, but in a very, so it's kind of values are back, but with our eyes wide open, because this is about not just promoting our values externally, but it's protecting our values inside.
Thank you. That was one of the best ways I've heard it described in terms of kind of geopolitical, interest-based, clear-eyed, strategic, but still values-based. Actually, potentially more values-based because it's become sharpened and clearer. In the last few years.
I mean, I really can't underline enough just how this war, when you have President Zelensky that talks about how this is a war on not just on Ukraine, but on Europe. This is something that resonates with European citizens a lot.
Yes, I think it's a reminder. There's been an era, I think. I don't think it's been illiberal, but it's been a little bit where liberal values, non-liberal, yes, non-liberal. Perhaps where it's a little bit déclassé to have these liberal values, and then there are moments when they become sharpened.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Tocci, thank you so much. There were many other guest questions, but I am selfishly glad that you answered mine and we had such a fantastic discussion after your wonderful talk. And I'm so delighted and grateful that we had you here today during such a busy time, but it's such an important moment for both your analysis of the current events, but also your very important bigger picture of both past and future analysis of the context and what's at stake in terms of existential crises, both war and climate. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Lovely being with you.